region. The Russian Parliament and the Foreign Minister earlier expressed concern over the situation in Crimea and asked the President to take measures to protect the citizens of the autonomous republic. And RT's Irina Galushko has been following the reaction in Moscow to the events in Crimea. Let's go live to her right now. Hi there, Irina. So did we get any idea what Russian MPs want to see happen next? Irina, can you hear us?
Yes. Now we know that President Putin has turned to the upper house of the Russian Parliament with asking them for the permission to allow Russian troops on the ground in Ukraine until the situation there normalizes. Now this comes after both houses of the Russian Parliament have turned to the President, asking him to take measures in order to stabilize the situation, particularly in Crimea, in order to protect the population, including the Russian-speaking population, from any further violence or upheaval in that region. So we're watching that very closely right now. At this point, we have no idea about what number of troops we could possibly be even talking about. But of course, I'm imagining we'll be getting all the information pretty soon.
Irina, yesterday you were in Rostov-on-Don. You were listening to the ousted president's speech there. What exactly did he have to say, please? Could you remind us?
Well, yes, of course. One of the most, you can say one of the main ideas that the ousted President Yanukovych has to say was the fact that he does not recognize the legitimacy of those who call themselves the government of Ukraine at the moment. He insisted he still is the president of Ukraine, and logically and judicially that is absolutely correct, because he hasn't been impeached nor has he resigned, and he's still very much alive. So technically he is the elected president of Ukraine. He talked about the reasons why he had to leave Ukraine. He said it was after attempts on his life and after threats that him and his family have received, including threats to the life of his youngest grandson. He's also talked about the fact that he does not in any way believe that Ukraine possibly could be divided. That is one of the things that he has underlined on numerous occasions. He also took a chance to apologize to the police, the Berkut, the Golden Eagles, who have been in standoff for months in the central Kiev on the square with the protesters, and who have carried heavy losses. He said that he has seen them and he has expressed his condolences already, but he wanted to do it once again. And he also said that he's determined to fight for Ukraine's future and to see that Ukraine stays undivided, stays the way it is right now. He's also actually mentioned the fact that he is hoping that President Putin will somehow take measures in order to stabilize the situation in Ukraine. He actually said that he was surprised that the Russian president hasn't done or said anything already in that regard, knowing his character. So those are just some of the things that he said. But also Yanukovych, you can say, wrapped up the entire conference with the fact saying that he does not believe the people of Ukraine will follow the current self-proclaimed government in the country right now.
And earlier also, Irina, we were witnessing what was happening at an urgent session of the Russian Parliament, the State Duma, which was discussing the provision of aid to the Crimean autonomy. Could you tell us more about that as well? Please remind us.
Absolutely. Well, one of the most important aspects in this entire situation with Ukraine is the fact that there is a lot of Russian nationals and, of course, people who consider themselves to be ethnically Russian who live in the east and particularly in Crimea. And it's their fate, their safety and security is of primary concern for the Russian legislators at this particular moment. That is why they have turned with official address to the Russian president, asking him to get involved in order to stabilize the situation, in order to protect these very people who are essentially Russian from any aggression from the radical groups that are operating in Ukraine. And it is becoming considerably more and more unsafe for them there, you can say. At some points, I actually felt like I was uncomfortable speaking Russian when I was in Kiev, and that for a lot of people in Russia and in eastern Ukraine is absurd. The Russophobia is on the rise, particularly because of the radicals who are operating, who seem to be streaming in from western Ukraine, and of course, a lot of whom have actually permeated the branches of the government, and that is also one of the statements that was made by representatives of the Federal Council earlier today.
She's Irina Galushka live there. Irina, thank you very much indeed. We appreciate it. And earlier, the authorities in Ukraine's southern Republic of Crimea asked the Russian president for help following an attempt to capture key administrative buildings by armed men sent by the new authorities in Kiev. RT's Igor Piskunov has all the details.
Well, groups of gunmen from Kiev attempted to capture several government buildings here in the Crimea, fired arms and used sound grenades as well, but the self-defense squads managed to repel these attacks, although there are reports of injuries among them. Now, local authorities are saying that they will continue to protect the Crimea from any radical threats coming from extremists who hijacked power in Kiev as a result of a coup, and we are also hearing from the local prime minister, the prime minister of this autonomous republic, that he's now put all the local security forces, including the police, the military, the navy, and the border guards, under his personal control.
The police are now demoralised, the security forces are incapable of controlling the situation, and there are armed groups on the territory of Crimea. Taking all that into account, it's been decided that temporarily I am in command of all the security forces in Crimea, and they follow only my orders.
The authorities here have also changed the date of a referendum aimed to decide whether or not the Crimea should gain more independence from Kiev. The date has been changed from May to March, so basically in the very nearest future. And also authorities here in the Crimea are asking Russia for help.
Russia is deeply concerned with the recent developments in Crimea. In the early hours of March the 1st, armed men sent from Kiev made an attempt to seize the Interior Ministry of the Crimean Autonomous Republic. This treacherous provocation left several people injured. Thanks to the resolute actions of the self-defense squads, the attempt to seize the building was repelled. This latest incident proves that certain political circles in Kiev are eager to destabilize the situation in the Crimean Peninsula. We urge those who issue such orders from Kiev to show restraint. We believe that a further escalation of the already tense situation in Crimea is irresponsible.
You've just listened to a statement coming from the Russian foreign minister, which said it's quite alarmed about these attacks which happened over the night here, and said it's very unproductive for the new authorities in Kiev to aggravate the situation here like that.
And if you want to know more about the conflict in Crimea, especially how the Russian-speaking population feels about the new authorities in the capital, look for RT's Igor Piskunov's report on our website. Meanwhile, thousands of Ukrainians are currently protesting against new Nazi groups and the Maidan movement. Demonstrations are taking place in a number of cities across the east and south of the country, with Kharkov, Donetsk and Odessa among them. In Kharkov, some sources suggest 100,000 of protesters gathered to tell the new authorities to leave the city. There are reports of clashes and gunfire causing some injuries. Meanwhile, in Donetsk, crowds have formed to tell the new leaders they're not welcome there. Demonstrators have already taken the center of the city and raised the Russian flag over the local administration. Now, while the Russian Parliament debates concrete steps to help the people in Crimea, Ukrainian police officers who were disbanded by the new government in Kiev are already receiving aid. Those who were stationed in Crimea are being offered Russian passports starting from this Saturday. RT's Maria Finoshna reports.
This is the Golden Eagle's swan song, the Berkut, Ukraine's elite police force. After weeks of deadly clashes in the capital Kiev, on the orders of the Ministry of Internal Affairs to protect government buildings from rioters, the Berkuts are no more. Ukraine's new authorities were quick to disband the 1,000-strong anti-riot unit. Officers were made to publicly kneel in western Ukraine and beg for forgiveness, while locals shouted shame, pelting them with objects. The country's acting interior minister posted on his internet page that the Berkuts are finished.
It's hard for us. There are many among us who sacrificed their health and lives to protect citizens, and after 22 years of service, they just threw us out like garbage. It's painful.
Viktor Denisov spent 2 decades in the Ukrainian police. He says the Berkuts in Kiev were simply unprepared to face armed protesters while trying to carry out their duty. On Friday, during his press briefing in Russia, President Yanukovych did apologize for that.
Unarmed Berkut officers have had Molotov cocktails thrown at them, been shot at by live ammunition, and killed. I apologize to these courageous people who have stood up and suffered.
I can't say that I don't accept these apologies. At the end of the day, we didn't fight for Yanukovych, and it was not him personally we protected. We tried to protect public order to allow the state to function.
I show Viktor one of numerous videos posted on YouTube showing the Berkuts in action. He keeps silent while watching.
On these videos, you can't see what these people who the Berkuts are beating were doing before they were arrested. What was going on there was a real war, and only experienced people with special training could tolerate that, and the violence they witnessed led to more violence.
Vladimir, head of Berkut Veteran Association, believes that the warring sides were far from equal.
The Berkuts faced a well-financed and a well-trained force. Their reconnaissance was excellent. They knew about our tactics and strategies. We were naked and blind.
With Berkut's reputation now fatally undermined by the interim government in Kiev, there remains at least one place in Ukraine where they're still respected. Ukraine's southern autonomous region of Crimea recognized neither Kiev's new masters nor their laws, and they refused to disarm the Berkuts. In fact, they reinforced them instead.
This is the headquarters of Ukraine's Berkut here in Crimea's Simferopol. As you can see, the building is surrounded by barricades and patrolled round the clock. So-called People's Guards are here day and night. They say they're worried about attacks. This is the upside-down reality of Ukraine today. Those whose mission just until recently was to secure peace and prosperity of the country's population are today in need of protection themselves.
People here have different backgrounds. They're from different ethnic groups, but they share one common goal.
We are protecting Berkut from the army of thugs who came to power as the result of the armed coup. They are controlling the puppet government that's issuing decrees at gunpoint, including disarming and storming Berkut. We are protecting their families. Berkut's officers are also our protectors against people who are committing armed terror in other areas of Ukraine.
Those who gathered here say they don't want violence, but if it comes here, they would be ready to resist, even if they have to pay with their own lives. RT from Crimea.
And RT's Irina Galushko has been following the reaction in Moscow to the events in Crimea. So, Irina, what is the reaction then?
Well, we know that both houses, both chambers of the Russian Parliament have turned to the Russian president on Saturday, asking him to stabilize the situation in Ukraine, and they have received their answer. Just minutes ago, the Russian president has turned with his address to the Federation Council with the permission for the use of Russian troops on the ground in Ukraine, not just Crimea. Now, that is before the warmongering starts. That is quite a lengthy process. There's probably several days. There's definitely more than 3 days that we have to wait until any decision is being made by the Federation Council, because they are the ones who have to give the okay to the president. But the reason for all of this, of course, is the fact that there is a grave concern in the Russian Parliament about the fate of Russian nationals who live eastern Ukraine and in Crimea in particular. They are saying that the actions of the current self-proclaimed government in Ukraine pose danger to the well-being and safety of these nationals, considering the rise in Russophobia, which is coming primarily from the radical nationalist groups who have permeated all branches of Ukrainian legislature at the moment, who are very active in trying to destabilize the situation in the country with numerous provocations. And this is primarily the main reason why there have been cries for help, or I would say even addresses, formal addresses, petitions from the country's legislative body to the Russian president in order to get some reaction and to facilitate some security for those Russians who reside in Ukraine.
She's Irina Galushko live there from Moscow. And just to remind you, our breaking news here on RC International, that President Putin appeals to the Federation Council of the Russian Federation to allow to send troops to Ukraine until the situation is stabilized there. And for more on the situation in Ukraine, we're now joined live from Belgrade by Sergei Trifkovic, a journalist and expert on international affairs. Mr. Trifkovic, welcome to RC. Nice to talk to you here. So the Russian president has asked Parliament for permission to use a limited army contingent to stabilize the situation in Crimea. How could that change the situation on the ground?
In my personal opinion, Ukraine is heading towards disintegration, or at least a form of federalization, to which the Russians can make a stabilizing contribution. Because any attempt by the mobocracy that has gained power in Kiev to establish its writ in not only Crimean Peninsula, but also in the other southern parts, such as Odessa and Nikolaev, and the eastern provinces, Donetsk and Kharkov, can only lead to an outright civil war. Ukraine is internally divided between people in the center and the west who have a radically different self-perception and radically different values and images of the future for themselves to people in the east and the south. And in the long term, I think that the Russian leaders realize that some form of federal, if not confederal, order is the only way to prevent further bloodshed and outright disintegration of this somewhat hybrid country.
And what reaction should we expect from the new authorities in Kiev?
Oh, they will scream blue murder, of course, and likewise there will be negative reactions all over the Western world. But I think the response should be, in 1999, you violated, through armed aggression, the sovereignty of Serbia in order to help the secession of Kosovo and to help the Albanian KLA there. And now we are acting in a similar vein that you regarded as both legally and morally justified. But in fact, I think the Russians have much greater right to intervene in Ukraine, not only because of some 10 million Russians who live there and a further 20 million Ukrainians who feel close to the Russians, but also because its status as a great power is jeopardized if NATO is allowed to play havoc on the eastern borders of Ukraine. That must not be allowed. That would be a geopolitical disaster of the greatest magnitude.
Crimea's referendum on autonomy has now been moved forward 2 months. What reaction do you expect from Kiev if there's a positive vote on Crimea breaking away?
Well, of course, they will claim that it is an illegal and unconstitutional referendum, forgetting along the way that they reached power by illegal and unconstitutional means. Basically, for the new authorities in Kiev and their handlers and aiders and abettors in the Western world, what is sauce for the goose is not sauce for the gander. But I would expect and look forward to similar referenda being organized not only in Kiev, but also in Odessa further west along the Black Sea coast, and in Donetsk and Kharkov to the northeast. Because, let's face it, as I've already said, Ukraine is a deeply divided country which only through devolution and through federalization can avoid the danger of outright civil war and disintegration.
Meanwhile, we're getting news that Kiev's self-appointed Prime Minister promised to ruin Crimea's vital tourist industry by blocking entry from Russia, Belarus and Europe unless Russian troops leave. What do you make of his threat?
Well, it's actually quite the contrary. I think that foreign tourists would far rather come to the Crimean Peninsula guarded by Russian troops than policed by the thugs from Lvov and Ivano-Frankovsk who came to Kiev to effect the regime change. If they are allowed to descend upon southern and eastern parts of Ukraine, and they are very gung-ho and ready for violence, that would be a disaster which the Russian president was well advised to preclude by sending troops.
We know that the EU powers and the US again pledged support for the self-proclaimed authorities in Kiev. How do you think they'll react to the news of an attempted assault by forces sent from the capital, Kiev?
I think that would be a purely verbal expression of support. I do not expect that either the EU or the US would be willing to escalate this dispute beyond the point of no return, because after all, they realize that for the EU it is a peripheral issue, for the United States it is an optional crisis, and for the Russians and eastern and southern Ukrainians it is an existential issue, and that the reactions will be accordingly different, because the Russians cannot allow a Ukraine ruled by neo-fascists from Lvov, and they cannot allow the Ukraine that would seek yet again NATO membership, which would be extremely disruptive of the geopolitical balance in Eastern Europe, while on the other hand, for the West, it's simply a geopolitical playing field in the game of surrounding Russia and exercising what an American geopolitical expert called the anaconda strategy. So I think that the sooner the Russians react and protect both the Crimean Peninsula and the surrounding eastern and southern areas, the better, because the quicker the action, the less of a reaction there will be from the West.
We've also heard threats from some quarters calling for Ukraine to rebuild nuclear weapons as leverage against Russia. And we remember the West was quick to condemn Iran for suspected nuclear arms. So what will it make of these almost direct threats here?
I think it's a bit of bravado. Neither has the Ukrainian scientific community and arms industry the capacity to do so, nor would it be allowed to do so, because if it were indeed on the cards, I have no doubt that Russian special forces would be sent not only to Crimea, but to wherever these installations happen to be, and also against Kiev itself. That would be an outright provocation that nobody can afford at this moment in time, except perhaps for some neurotics like the US Senator John McCain.
Okay. And finally, nobody seems to be taking Mr. Yanukovych into account anymore. Has he any chance of a comeback? What do you think?
I don't think so, because even people who used to support him were terribly disillusioned by his poor performance. In fact, his indecisiveness and then his lukewarm attempts to contain the tide, as I warned on your program some weeks ago, were the sign of weakness that could only increase the appetites of the other side. He now stands largely discredited, and I think it would be very important for the Russian and pro-Russian Ukrainians to find another, more energetic, perhaps younger leader who is not tainted by corruption and who would be able to articulate their interests and not the interests of his ruling oligarchy. I think that Yanukovych is a spent force.
Sergei Trifkovich, a journalist and expert on international affairs. Mr. Trifkovich, thank you very much. And as our guest just mentioned, no one takes it seriously, but representatives of the new Ukrainian government are already threatening to quite literally go nuclear. A deputy from the Svoboda party warns that Kiev could go back on its own constitution and restock its nuclear arsenals within 6 months. Anastasia Churkina reports.
Double standards galore. Washington suffers sleepless nights and paranoia when it comes to the nuclear capabilities of countries like Iran.
Iran's nuclear program.
Iran's nuclear program.
Iran's nuclear program.
But the U.S. turns a blind eye when it comes to provocative statements coming out of Kiev. One member of the Ukrainian Parliament's ultra-nationalist Svoboda party warned that if Russia doesn't tread carefully, it will be dealing with a nuclear power. That's the rhetoric despite Ukraine signing up to the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1994.
There is a double standard when it comes to the way that the United States deals with a supposed nuclear threat from Iran. Which, let's not forget, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Iran intends to develop nuclear weapons for aggressive military purposes.
Unlike Iran, the warning from the Ukrainian lawmaker includes an actual deadline of just a few months. This in a conflict-torn country where even the most pessimistic predictions ended up becoming a reality. But none of that seems to disturb the U.S.
The money that we can't use to feed the poor and the hungry in the United States and in Europe, that money is going to support Nazis in Ukraine with nuclear ambitions who are looking to destabilize the region and whose sole goal is the destruction of Russia.
Yet another example of hypocrisy flying high from the country that touts itself as the world's leading democracy. Anastasia Churkina, RT, New York.
So how real is Kiev's nuclear threat? And here are some facts on the country's atomic industry. Ukraine gets half of its energy from nuclear sources. One of its plants is Europe's largest, and all the reactors are designed in Russia due to historical ties between the atomic agencies. So, is that enough to make a weapon? Ukraine does have facilities and scientists in that field, but it lacks its own fuel, getting non-weapons grade material from Russia. Now you can still put together a dirty bomb with that without wasting much time to get to the right enrichment level. But this would break Ukraine's international commitments not to use or produce nuclear weapons and contradict its own constitution. As for delivery vehicles, a nuclear payload can be fitted in a simple artillery shell or rocket. And let's now take a look at the suggested time frame. 3 to 6 months isn't enough to construct an atomic bomb as we know it, but it is enough for a radioactive dirty bomb, although political and economic analyst Martin Seif from the Globalist News website thinks this scenario is quite unlikely.
These threats are probably extreme and irresponsible bluff, but it's very alarming to hear them being made in the first place. The new government which has now emerged in Kiev and other figures like the opposition statement need to act in a responsible manner to earn the deserved respect and trust and cooperation of the international community. That comment is disastrously counterproductive and should be seen as such.
RT's Irina Galushka has been following the reaction in Moscow to the events in Crimea, and she joins us now live. Hi there, Irina. What exactly did the Russian president request, and what's Parliament's position here?
Well, the Russian president has requested that he gets permission to use Russian troops on the ground in Ukraine in order to protect Russian nationals, Russian citizens, and the contingent of Russian troops who are stationed in Crimea from the danger that is posed to them because of the unstable situation in Ukraine at the moment. Now, this comes after both houses of the Russian parliament have sent their petitions, official petitions, to the Russian president saying that he should get involved in the situation because of the danger that is posed to the Russians who live in Ukraine. And there is quite a considerable number of them there, particularly in the east and in Crimea. Now, there has been a lot of news sources which say that President Putin has asked the Federation Council for permission to use troops only in Crimea, and that is incorrect. I'd like to emphasize the fact that it's in the entire Ukraine that was mentioned in this official address from the Russian president.
Irina, and what happens next? How soon could this deployment happen?
Well, we were looking at days, not hours, definitely. First of all, they addressed the petition, or will have to be explored by at least two bodies, at least two councils, which will be composed in the Federation Council. After they come together and decide and make up their mind, there will have to be a presentation by the president himself before the Federation Council. Afterwards, there will be a vote, and after the vote is counted, the decision of the Federation Council will be officially sent to the Russian president. Obviously, that is not going to happen incredibly fast, so we couldn't be looking at the troops moving in direction of Ukraine as early as today or tomorrow. Definitely not the case.
RT's Irina Galushko live there. Irina, thank you very much indeed for that update.